Hi there. I'm making these videos in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And just to the east of San Francisco is Alameda. And it's a shipyard, and docked in that shipyard is the USS Hornet, an aircraft carrier. World War II was a war of aircraft carriers, and maybe most of all, we need to know that the Pacific Theater was all about aircraft carriers and air power. It was also about navies. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about the Pacific Theater. And please understand that the war in the Pacific was actually going on at the same time as the war in Europe. It's kind of mind-blowing that Americans and people all over the world had to consider all of these different battles going on in different places. And when their loved ones went to serve overseas, they didn't know which sea they were going over. We're going to talk about some of the battles of the Pacific Theater. You know that Pearl Harbor was the tragic beginning of American involvement, and on December 7th, 1941, that event sparked the beginning of America's involvement in World War II. And on December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan, and then Germany promptly declared war on the United States. On December 8th, that's when the Japanese continued to attack other places in Southeast Asia, basically trying to make sure that the British didn't retaliate and the United States wouldn't be able to retaliate for the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so that was devastating, and it took months for the American people to rally and understand that they had to be ready to sacrifice themselves for not only other people's freedom, but for their own freedom. And that leads us to some of the first engagements of the Pacific Theater between the United States and Japan. It's important to know that the Philippines was under the protection of the United States. It was a colony of the United States after the Spanish-American War. But America had always promised the Philippines that eventually the Philippines could get independence and be their own nation. There was a hard history between the United States and the Philippines, and we've discussed that. We talked about the insurrection that took place that became the American-Philippine War, and that was tragic. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected, either injured or imprisoned or killed. And so it's pretty remarkable that the Philippines was an area where so many Filipino people fought on the side of the Americans to defend their country and to support the American war cause. Between May 4th and May 8th in 1942, so this is about 5 months, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were flexing their muscles. They wanted to show the United States that it was futile to get involved in this war. They should just surrender and let Japan increase its sphere of influence. That leads us to the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the Coral Sea is basically the area around New Guinea. It's many different islands that were involved in this conflict. And it also involved the Philippines. And in the Philippines, simultaneously was the Battle of Bataan. And this would be a tragedy for the United States. The Battle of Bataan was lost, and tens of thousands of American soldiers were taken captive. They became prisoners of war. And so Bataan fell, and then finally the last place of refuge in the Philippines, Corregidor. Corregidor was a stronghold with a tunnel system beneath a fortified military base. And General MacArthur had his headquarters there, but he kind of knew that Japan was moving that direction, and so he moved his headquarters and wanted to evacuate the president of the Philippines. Well, Bataan fell, and then Corregidor eventually fell as well, and it was a humiliation for the United States. But during this same 5-day period, May 4th through 8th, something else happened. The United States didn't just allow Japan to keep taking over territory. They met force with force. And it was the first aircraft carrier battle in history. So the Japanese planned to invade Port Moresby in New Guinea, and like so many other situations in World War II, a code was broken, and the Allies discovered what the Japanese were going to do. They knew that they were going to invade New Guinea, and so they sent their navy and several carriers, and basically were able to create almost a stalemate situation. Of course, the Philippines was lost. General MacArthur, upon leaving, is famous for saying, "I shall return." And he did. In 1945, Corregidor was recaptured. But the casualties from this battle included 2 carriers on each side. So again, that gives us the impression of a stalemate. And the 2 carriers the Japanese lost were the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. And the Americans lost, the Yorktown was damaged, and the Lexington exploded spectacularly, probably because it had torpedoes and bombs on board, and there are pictures of it exploding after it had been struck by a Japanese aircraft. So that was a pretty dramatic battle in May of 1942, and it was really just the warm-up for what happened a month later. It's important, too, that we mention that with the fall of Bataan, that all these prisoners of war, they had to be dealt with. And under the Geneva Conventions, the idea was prisoners of war had rights, and they should be taken care of, given food, not treated with cruel and unusual punishment. And unfortunately, every abuse that could possibly happen took place with the Bataan Death March. It was a death march because almost 20,000 of those soldiers that had been taken as prisoners of war, almost 20,000 died. 18,000 of them were Filipino. About 500 or 600 were Americans. And this is something that still is a point of contention today, because people in Japan sometimes want to ignore their abuses from World War II. They want to ignore the fact that they were an aggressor during the war, not only with Pearl Harbor, but also in China. They want to ignore the Nanjing Datusha, the massacre of Nanjing or Nanking. And they want to ignore the Bataan Death March. These are the black marks against the Japanese. There are absolutely black marks against American troops. There were massacres committed, even against prisoners of war. Once Germany had continued to fight on and had been guilty of many atrocities, people take out their anger on the enemy. And so this is just a reminder to us that we're all weak when it comes to carrying out justice. None of us is a righteous instrument of justice, but we do know that in the end, justice is done. Now, Admiral Yamamoto was a mastermind. He had masterminded the invasion or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. and he also masterminded the Battle of Midway. He designed it as a trap that would be set for Americans, drawing them in and then going for the kill. And he had determined that this would be the defining battle of World War II. What he didn't know is that once again, the Americans had cracked the code. The Americans knew that Midway was a trap, and so they were able to plan, prepare for this battle. They sent additional ships to the area, and it became a massive aircraft carrier battle. And ultimately, Japan lost far more than the United States lost. So the United States lost one aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier that was sunk was the Yorktown. The Hornet was also involved, but it was not the same Hornet as the one that is near Oakland, nearby me. Unfortunately, that Hornet was sunk in the Solomon Islands not too much longer after the Yorktown. And just this year, I think on February 19th, it was announced that the Yorktown, the wreckage of the Yorktown in the Solomon Islands was discovered. And that's always kind of exciting, all this technology that we have now to explore the wrecks of ships that were sunk during World War II. So the Yorktown was sunk during the Battle of Midway, but the Japanese lost their aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. 4 aircraft carriers were sunk. This is mind-blowing. It was a miraculous battle. Maybe never before and never again will there be a battle like the Battle of Midway. And so this was definitely a turning point of the war. It wasn't the turning point that Yamamoto thought it would be. Now, Yamamoto is a very interesting person, and we'll come back to him in just a little bit. A little side note here. I'll never forget when I was 7 or 8 or 9 years old, I used to play games with my brother, mainly because he liked to beat me. And he would always win the games we played. He was a great strategist. In fact, he designs his own games today and gets them published. That's how good he is. But one of the games we played was called Midway, and it represented the Battle of Midway. And you had these little square pieces that you moved around the board to represent the aircraft carriers and the airplanes. And I'll never forget the names of those aircraft carriers. On the U.S. side, the Enterprise and the Yorktown and the Hornet, the 3 carriers that represented the good old U.S. And on the other side, you had the Hiryu, the Soryu, the Kaga, etc., etc., etc. And Japan always had more carriers and more troops. It seemed like Japan should win, and so I always chose the Japan side, and I always lost. So my brother, he knew how to play the game, and so did the U.S. As a result of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese realized that they were going to have replacement problems. They would have trouble replacing their aircraft carriers because they didn't have the same resources or industry that the United States had. And so the United States, now that the giant had been awakened, they would be able to produce ships to replace the ones that they had lost. In addition, they were losing soldiers, they were losing sailors, and this was critical. And so they were starting to recognize that they would have replacement problems and replacement issues. But that didn't stop the Japanese from continuing their assaults. They were very aggressive, feeling that it was better to fight honorably than to sit back or surrender. And you'll see again later how this is the case. We know that kamikaze pilots gave their lives and flew their airplanes into ships as weapons. And they would take their own life if they felt that they had somehow brought dishonor to their military or their country or their emperor. Well, the next battle we need to talk about happened a little later in the summer, It started on August 7th when Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal. And these are tiny islands that we're talking about. And the U.S. soldiers were able to take over an airstrip, and this became known as Henderson Field. And then from August all the way to November, there were battles, attempts by the Japanese to bombard Henderson Field, and they were unsuccessful. The Japanese were not able to get that airfield back, and they started to get frustrated. So the Marines held on to Henderson Field, and then the Japanese launched a naval battle to try and surround the island, and that naval battle also failed. And this is a sign that even though the Japanese are continuing to be aggressive, they will no longer be able to continue to push forward. Instead, they'll have to start playing defense rather than playing offense. And so the naval battle lasted from November 12th to November 15th. And you'll notice that these naval battles, are so much shorter than the long land battles. And at the same time, these naval battles really shaped the war. Already in 1942, the United States was realizing that it couldn't just be satisfied with conventional warfare, fighting with guns and ships and planes. The United States realized it needed to fight psychological warfare, just as the Japanese had fought psychological warfare by bombing Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack. And so that brings us to the Doolittle raid. Jimmy Doolittle, an unsung hero in some ways. Everyone should know his name. And he led the first bombing raid, which was launched from the Hornet. The deck of the Hornet provided the launch pad. And 16 bombers went out to bomb Tokyo. So this would take the war to Japan. Now, honestly, what can be done with 16 bombers in this massive war to this massive Japanese military machine? It didn't do that much damage, but what happened was Japan realized that they were not as safe as they thought they were. 15 of the 16 bombers ended up crashing in China, because that was the plan, to land in China. And the pilots, most of the pilots, there were 80 pilots in all, 80 personnel on the different planes, and 77 of them survived. One plane was captured. It actually landed safely in the Soviet Union, but the people on board were not just allowed to freely go wherever they wanted. This is, after all, it's a communist country and a totalitarian Stalinist state. But they were helped out of the country through Iran. So it's a long journey, but eventually they made it out of their country and they made it back to the United States. 70 of those original 80 crew members made it back to their countries or back to their military personnel. And Jimmy Doolittle then, he thought, he had lost all 16 of his planes. He thought he was going to get a court-martial. Instead, he earned the Medal of Honor. And his name is on the Air Force Memorial in Washington, D.C., and I hope someday you'll be able to go and see it for yourself. Jimmy Doolittle is a hero for fighting this first shot against the enemy in the enemy's territory. Bottom line, the United States needed a base for attacks on Tokyo. They couldn't fly off of aircraft carriers all the time. And so they needed to establish island bases. And the approach that the Americans took was called leapfrogging or island hopping. And this meant that instead of going straight at Japan and doing a full frontal assault, that smaller islands would be taken over, especially if they were lesser defended. If there weren't many Japanese soldiers defending the islands, they could be taken over, and gradually, slowly but surely, the United States could make it to a place where they could attack Tokyo and Japan more freely. This took patience. It took patience on the part of the military. It took patience on the part of the American people. We talked about how the American people were like a sleeping giant that had risen up and could make aircraft carriers. We think of Rosie the Riveter, who represented the women who were working in factories to make weapons at home. And she wasn't a real person. She was just an advertisement for what women were doing. And many men continued to fight because they realized that the women back at home were supporting them in this way. And there were many women, obviously, who went out into harm's way and fought in the war in one way or another. So the United States needed a base for attacks, and that led them to Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is an island close to Japan, so the United States is getting closer and closer. And from February 19th to March 26th in 1945, finally you have the Battle of Iwo Jima. And this is famous for a number of reasons, because it was a very bloody battle. The Japanese on the island refused to surrender, and instead they were killed. And so 20,000 Japanese soldiers died. Only a couple of hundred were captured, and most of them had to be, smacked on the head, unconscious, so that they could be taken prisoner. Otherwise, they would either fight until they died or kill themselves. There were actually more U.S. casualties in the Battle of Iwo Jima than on the Japanese side, but there were only 1/3 as many deaths. So casualties, remember, includes all injuries and not just deaths. It's the raising of the U.S. flag on the island of Iwo Jima that has been memorialized in the Marine Corps Memorial, which is in Washington, D.C. I hope you get to see that for yourself. It's a profound memorial because it's designed so that as you walk around the memorial, it seems like the flag is rising up. And that is the image that was made famous by a photographer and then used for the memorial of 5 U.S. soldiers, I think, raising that U.S. flag. So Iwo Jima was a huge victory and a huge turning point, and it's March of 1945. I want to mention Admiral Yamamoto and what happened to him. We talked about Jimmy Doolittle launching his raid on April 18th, 1942. Exactly 1 year later, on April 18th, 1943, another message was intercepted by the Allies regarding Admiral Yamamoto's flight plan. And because of that, his plane was shot down, and there was revenge for his design of Pearl Harbor. It's a little bit like the attack on Osama bin Laden that eventually killed him. Revenge isn't usually as sweet as people would like it to be, but there is some sense of justice that Admiral Yamamoto was killed in action in this way by the soldiers that had probably lost friends and loved ones. Finally, the last battle that we're going to talk about is from April 1st. It's not an April Fool's joke. From April 1st to June 22nd, 1945, you had the Battle of Okinawa, which is just south of Japan, the main Japanese islands. And this would be the fiercest battle of the war. It would involve not just Japanese troops, but also Okinawan troops. In fact, 150,000 Okinawans perished in the Battle of Okinawa. They were mostly forced to fight for the Japanese. That was half of the population of Okinawa. Okinawa is currently one of the main military bases that the United States has around the world. Many people in Japan do not want that military base there, but it's a lingering effect of World War II and a reminder that the United States has has declared that they will maintain a presence around the world so that something like World War II can't happen again. This was the largest amphibious assault in history. And again, this took place just after, it started before D-Day, but this is I should say this, it's the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. I'm not sure how it compares to D-Day. It was known as the Typhoon of Steel, as these troop carriers just kept coming wave after wave onshore in a very similar situation to what happened at D-Day. This would be the last beachhead that needed to be established so that the enemy was within striking distance. It would be a base for the operation that would be called Operation Downfall. That would be the assault on Tokyo. Now, things didn't work out as many of those soldiers thought they would. And we will talk about that in our next video. Thanks for watching.